Good evening, class. My name is Chris Bergstrom from Chicago, Illinois. Here to talk to you today about healthcare data sets as they pertain to patients, medical facilities, and how they can impact healthcare overall. First off, what are secondary data sets? Secondary data sets, whether an organization wants to even obtain them, get them anyway. These are the pieces of information that pertain to a patient diagnosis, their demographic information, and really all of the information that is contained within the patient's electronic medical record. Within this medical record, there are pieces of information, whether a healthcare provider, a pharmaceutical company, a research facility want to use these pieces of information is all up to that facility. A lot of times, healthcare facilities, hospitals, research buildings have these pieces of information and don't even know what to do with it or don't even know that they have it. However, within the electronic medical record, all of this is included with the patient. Anytime a patient goes to a hospital, a healthcare provider, all of that paperwork that gets filled out prior to the first meeting with the physician or healthcare provider gets recorded in that electronic medical record. Now what that means is that pieces of information are within that medical record that the day of that visit, the physician or healthcare provider may not even need access to or may not even care to access it. For that visit, that piece of information or pieces of information may not even be important to that healthcare provider. What that means is that each one of us carry an electronic medical record, and within that medical record there are all kinds of secondary data sets. These data sets may have to do with our demographics, our past medical history, our treatment plans for our current medical history. All of these things can be used in collaboration with each other's medical records to create these large data sets that can be used for various different things, from insurance provider information, to be able to use that information to group patients together, to group therapies together based on these secondary data sets. This also has an effect for our healthcare providers. The way that medicine is delivered can be changed by using all of these large secondary data sets to see which ways of delivering medicine are the best, and therefore be able to mold treatment plans based on these large data sets. One example would be lawyers. Lawyers use case studies to set a precedent for how they deal with their clients. Well, healthcare can use that too, based on these secondary data sets. Healthcare providers can not only find one case to review and to compare a patient's history to, but hundreds or even thousands through these secondary data sets. That provides a precedent for healthcare providers to be able to use when working with patients with the same diagnosis. Again, not every patient diagnosis and treatment plan is going to be the same. Everybody's different. Everybody reacts differently to therapy. However, if a basic plan can be set in place and a good starting point can be set in place based on these secondary data sets and what has worked well with past patients with the same diagnosis, then you have a great starting point and you can reduce a lot of medical waste based on just knowing where to start with that patient. So this is a great benefit of these secondary data sets, to be able to use patients as a whole that share the same diagnosis and have a good starting point, or at least a starting point. A lot of times doctors, healthcare providers will run the spectrum of tests on a patient, which is great when ruling something out, but if we already know that a patient is diagnosed with something, wouldn't it be great to have a good starting point that could deliver immediate results? This, therefore, would reduce the time spent testing a patient to find a good way to treat their illness or their diagnosis, and it also reduces costs to the healthcare provider and the patient, because treatment can start right away and have a good value for what is being provided. This can also take place with insurance companies. They can group this secondary data with patients that share the same diagnosis and be able to say which healthcare providers are able to target and treat this diagnosis the best, and then share that with other healthcare providers. This also will reduce insurance costs and help the insurance providers reward healthcare facilities that are really providing the best care for their patients. These secondary data sets can provide valuable information to insurance companies, healthcare providers, and pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceuticals and research, using these secondary data sets, can take a large group of people with the same diagnosis and be able to look at what they all might share in common and to see why a certain drug might work with one group of people as opposed to the other. This is a great way to be able to really target individuals that share certain symptoms or the same diagnosis to be able to really target what the true problem is. Some of the challenges that are provided by these secondary data sets is, since we all carry an electronic medical record, we all have a secondary data set. The challenge there is, where do we start? There's anywhere you could start. You could start with a demographic, past medical history, projecting a future medical history. So the key here is to find a starting point. That, according to the PricewaterhouseCoopers data, is the biggest challenge for providers. Where to begin? There's so much data, it's hard to target and just find a starting point, whereas one of the executives said, without just starting from scratch. As easy as that sounds, it would probably be impossible to start from scratch. So the biggest challenge with these secondary data sets is where to begin. What information is absolutely vital? What information can be discarded? And how do we standardize the information so it applies to everybody in different healthcare settings? In a hospital, 5 different hospitals may provide the same medicine or the same treatment, but the delivery of how that medicine or treatment is delivered to the patient may differ. This would create a huge challenge in creating a standardized way of delivering care. Therefore, how do you differentiate which set of data is correct and which set of data is maybe not correct, given that both patients or all of patients were given the same therapy or the same treatment, just the delivery was different. From there, you could weed it down to, well, this delivery of therapy or treatment seemed to work well, so why don't we use that as our standard? By using secondary data sets to do things like this, we're able to provide the patient the best care, which is what the #1 goal of any healthcare organization, insurance company, or research facility should be: to be patient-centered, to provide the patient the best care possible. These secondary data sets are very important to be able to provide these patients the best care. The biggest challenge is finding a starting point. Now, given that we all carry an electronic medical record, one of the other issues is, how do we de-identify all of these records to be able to put into the community of information? That's another issue that comes into play. Every time a medical record is used for one of these data sets, all of the identifying information needs to be removed, which creates a huge challenge for IT professionals. This alone creates a difficult starting point, because you have to go through each electronic record individually to remove this data. So as you can see, secondary sets of information can be hugely beneficial to patients, healthcare providers, insurance companies, and for the future of healthcare. We can really predict and project going forward by using these secondary sets of information. The biggest challenges moving forward will be, how do we identify which pieces of information are important? How do we standardize it? And how can we best use this information to benefit the patient? Going forward, these are the challenges that healthcare providers face, but we're also in a fortunate position knowing that this information is out there and can be used to best treat patients.